Hey guys, it's Shara from Woodshop Diaries, and in this video we're going to be building something pretty basic, but it's something I've been wanting to build for a while. Over the years, I've gotten several requests for a simple shoe bench plan, and while I have a large collection of previous projects, I only had one shoe bench design, and to be honest, it wasn't my favorite. So for this video, I decided to revisit the idea with a brand new design. So if you're ready to dive in and get building a simple shoe bench, let's go. I wanted to build this bench with clean lines, basic materials, and easy assembly. First, let's start with the legs. So I have two 2x4s here that I'm gonna glue up to make the bench legs. And if you've been around for very long, you've seen me do this a lot of times before, but you may be wondering why I'm gluing up 2x4s to make legs instead of just using a 4x4. Where I live, there's no untreated 4x4s in the store unless you special order it. So special ordering, it takes a long time. They're actually a lot more expensive. And whenever I have gotten them, they look like absolute garbage. I would just much rather take the time to glue up some 2x4s. But if you have the option where you live to buy untreated 4x4s from the store and they look good and you want to use those, that would be fine too. I made the legs of this bench from 2x4s. I trimmed them down to about 72 inches long, which is a little more than enough to cut 4 legs from. Then I glued them together. In case you're wondering, I did not plane these boards first. I just tried to put the two flattest sides together. Once the glue was dry, I'm left with a 3-inch thick by 3.5-inch wide post. So I ran it through the table saw to cut about 1/4 of an inch off each side to make it square. This also removes the rounded edges and cleans up the glue squeeze out. If you don't have a table saw, you could use 4x4 posts instead, or sometimes you can find pre-glued and surfaced 3-inch square posts at the big box store. They are a little pricey, but that is an option. Once the post was square, I took it to the miter saw to trim down into my 4 legs. I mitered the ends of these 10 degrees so that the legs would slant in at the top. I just really like subtle angles, but if you'd rather, you could totally just cut these ends square. All dimensions, details, angles, and diagrams can be found in the building plans that I've linked in the video description below. Once the legs were trimmed, I grabbed some 1x3s to cut the rest of the bench frame from. I already had this stack of pre-primed 1x3s that I got for a project that I never actually built, so I just used some of these. However, regular unprimed 1x3s would work fine here. I'm painting anyway, so the fact that they were already primed was kind of convenient. From these boards, I trimmed down 4 pieces for the front and back of the frame. Exact dimensions are found in the plans. These front and back pieces will have mitered ends 10 degrees. Then I adjusted my miter angle back to 0 and cut 4 pieces for the sides of the bench frame. So 4 legs, 2 long top pieces, 2 longer bottom pieces, and 4 short side pieces. Once I had all of these cut, I gave them a good sanding. Once everything was sanded, I pulled out my pocket hole jig to drill pocket holes for assembly. So in case you ever wondered if you can still drill pocket holes into boards with mitered ends, you can. The only thing is you have to make sure that the edge of the board is flat on the edge of the jig. So the board will sit in the jig at an angle, but the edge will be flat on the jig. So that way when you drill your holes will still be square to the edge of the board. I drilled pocket holes into the ends of all the 1x3 pieces. Then I began assembly. I started with the short sides first, so this part is totally not difficult at all, but for some reason I felt it was kind of hard to explain the location of these pieces. Okay, so here's one of the legs and here's the top side support. So I want this edge to be square to the top, but I want it to be about 1 inch inset from the outside edge. So I've got my Craig multi-mark here and I've got it set at 1 inch. So I'm just gonna run it along here. So for the bottom, I want this also to be 1-inch inset from the outside edge of the leg. Just drew a line along the edge of the leg here. And I want it to be 3 inches up from the bottom, so I set my multi-mark to 3 inches, and I made a mark right here. So now I have an intersection. So I want this bottom edge to hit right at that corner, and I want this edge to be right along this line so that it's parallel to the bottom of the leg. So right there. Then I flipped it over and repeated for the other side. I know that sounds kind of complicated, but now that you see when I stand this up, the bottom piece here should be square to the table. I did this twice, once for each side of the bench. Now, attaching the front and back pieces is much easier. I just installed the top pieces flush to the top and 1-inch inset from the outside of the legs. Then I installed the bottom pieces 3 inches up from the bottom of the legs and 1-inch inset. Once secured to one side, I flipped it over and secured the other side the same way. And with that, the main bench frame is together. Now, you certainly don't have to fill the pocket holes, but I thought it would look a little cleaner once painted, so I filled these holes around the bottom framing. I already had these pre-cut plugs, but you could also use a 3/8 inch dowel to fill them or a few layers of wood filler. Now the bench base is almost done, except for I'm gonna run 2 more 1x3s across here to kind of make a support shelf for shoes. However, I knew if I went ahead and installed 2 more rails here, it was gonna be really hard to paint in between all of them. I'm going to cut 2 to fit, and then before I attach, I'm gonna go ahead and paint everything, and then I can attach them once it's dry. Because I was painting the bench base with a brush and roller, I cut these 2 rails for the shoe shelf to fit first, but painted them all separate before attaching. I just knew that it would be difficult to paint between the rails with a brush. If I was using a paint sprayer or staining the bench, I would definitely attach these before finishing. Now, my least favorite part of any project, paint. Since most of these pieces were pre-primed, I just applied a quick coat of primer to the legs and exposed wood, then sanded and applied paint. I used a brush in the corners first, then rolled everywhere that I could. I'm not a super clean painter, so don't look too close or judge too harshly. I was also in a hurry. After 2 coats, I allowed to dry, for at least as long as I could stand to, then I carefully tapped the 2 rails into the frame. I made sure that they were equally spaced, then countersunk holes to secure these with screws. Now, in hindsight, if I had carefully spaced out my holes here, I could have just used some wood plugs and made them a contrasting feature. However, I realized this after I had already drilled my holes and they were not neat or lined up. I really wish that I had thought about that prior, but it is what it is. I cut some small dowel pieces and plugged the holes. Wood filler would have also worked fine here too. Then I sanded them smooth and touched up the paint. While the paint fully cured, I moved on to making the final part, the seat. I trimmed 3 2x6 pieces about 42 inches long. I'm going to be trimming the bench seat down to 40 inches wide, so this gives me a little to trim off each end. Then I ran them through the table saw to remove the rounded edges. This is totally optional, but it makes for a cleaner glue up. feel like something must be wrong because I think that might have been the easiest glue up I've ever done in my life. Once the glue was dry, I trimmed the ends down so that they were smooth and clean, and the final length was 40 inches long. Then I sanded it well to remove all the glue squeeze out and flatten it down. And once it was sanded, all that was left was attaching it. To attach the top, I opted to use these figure-8 fasteners. Now, you could also use pocket holes and screws. That method just doesn't allow for wood movement, but honestly, in a bench seat like this, even if the seat split a little, it wouldn't really affect the function. Anyway, to attach these fasteners, I drilled 4 shallow holes in the top of the bench frame with a Forstner bit. Then I used a chisel to kind of open up the holes a little. This fastener needs to be able to swivel in the hole. I secured these with wood screws, then flipped this over onto the bench seat. After making sure the base was centered on the top, I attached the other side of the fastener to the top with screws. And with that, this build is complete. Now, I went back and forth debating on whether I wanted to stain the top or just poly it, but I ended up deciding to give it a golden oak stain before a few coats of poly. And now this simple shoe bench is ready for its new home at the end of the bed, by the front door, or in the hallway. I know this may not be one of my biggest builds, but I do think it's one of my favorites. Clean, simple, and practical. My kind of project. I really hope you guys enjoyed watching it come together, and if you want to keep up with all the latest projects, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Thanks so much for watching, friends, and until next time, happy building!